Well, it took nearly 2 years, but one of Fox's top anchors finally secured a lengthy sit-down with President Trump. Here's more of the interview with Chris Wallace.
No president has liked his press coverage. John Kennedy in your Oval Office canceled the subscription to the New York Herald Tribune. Nobody called it the enemy of the American people.
Chris, I'm calling the fake news is the enemy. It's fake. It's phony.
But a lot of times, sir, it's just news you don't like.
No, it's not. No. I don't mind getting bad news if I'm wrong.
I sat down with him moments ago on the set of Fox News Sunday. Chris Wallace, welcome.
Good to be with you on Mediabuzz.
Fascinating interview. The president says, I don't mind getting bad news if I'm wrong. What did you make of that, since the president very rarely admits that he is wrong?
Exactly. I really enjoyed and was anxious to have that part of the interview because I've not done a formal interview with him since December of 2016. Since the tweet about fake news is the enemy of the people, I've thought about it a lot. I've talked about it a lot. I've won press awards and given speeches about it. And I wanted to confront him with my thoughts, which are basically, look, you can criticize the media. You can criticize coverage. I think some of the coverage of you has been biased.
As you pointed out.
But don't call us the enemy of the American people. And then when he tried to sort of separate it and say, well, I'm talking about CNN, I'm not talking about you, it's like I wanted to make the point. We're all in solidarity on this. You know, you want to call specific stories, specific reporters out, go ahead, but don't say that we're the enemy of the people.
The president says he's only talking about fake news, but he's also said that fake news is 80% of the media by his calculation. Did you have the sense that he is deeply offended by that? Or is it also, separately, the fact that he uses the press as such an effective foil?
Yes. In other words, both.
Yeah.
I think that he really feels that he's been the victim of bad reporting, and he says, all of our successes get downplayed. And again, I think there's some truth in that. As I have said in some speeches, even hypochondriacs sometimes really get sick. On the other hand, I think that while he does feel in some cases legitimately aggrieved, I think he also thinks that it's a very good talking point. And when he was defending it, he talked in terms of my supporters, and they get it. The fact that there's a lot of good news in the country and it doesn't get reported, I think he sees it absolutely as a kind of wedge issue that helps him at the expense of the media and media criticism, and also the expense of his political opposition.
You asked him about a spate of stories portraying him as being very angry and lashing out since the midterms. The Washington Post called it days of fury. The LA Times, and you quoted this, said he's retreated into a cocoon of bitterness and resentment. Let's take a look.
How dark is your mood?
It's very light. It's fake news. It's disgusting fake news. I read a front page story in the Washington Post. They never even call me. Nobody ever calls me. You know, they hear. I don't even think they have sources. I think they just make it up like it's fiction.
These are two of his favorite lines, that many of the sources are made up and that nobody ever calls me, as if a reporter can just call up and get the president on the line very quickly.
Right.
And the Washington Post did quote a senior White House official on his behalf in that particular piece.
Right. First of all, it was the first question I asked because, one, I was legitimately interested. I also thought, you know, there's a lot of tough stuff I wanted to ask him about. I wanted to ask about the Mueller investigation, about staff changes, about Khashoggi, and I thought, let's just talk about you. We know this president has no problem. The way the question began was, let's talk about the state of Donald Trump. And it was interesting to me, and I will say, not just in the interview, but just the entire time. We spent about an hour with him, the better part of an hour. He was very upbeat. He seemed very comfortable, very at ease in his own skin. I have to say, because it was the first formal interview in these 2 years he's been president, very at ease being the commander-in-chief. He has his command of his brief. He is comfortable in the Oval Office. I mean, he's the president, and he knows it, and he's very much at ease with it. Now, maybe he's mad to staff, but I would say that he was very good-spirited despite some tough, challenging questions in our interview.
Well, in addition to pushing back on the notion that he's angry and lashing out, and maybe some of those stories are overstated, although clearly he's gone on the attack a lot. He said the White House is running like a well-oiled machine. That seemed to be pushing it a little bit. Yeah,
and I would say, you know, as the line goes, I wouldn't be lending any money at this point to either John Kelly or to Kirstjen Nielsen. I mean, he gave them far less than full-throated endorsements. Could you imagine a president saying about a chief of staff ever, well, there's some things about him I like and there's some some things about him I don't like. I mean, I remember when Ronald Reagan made a very, very mild statement about Don Regan when I was covering him in '87. We all knew right away he was dead.
It certainly didn't give credence to the notion that he's definitely staying as chief of staff through 2020. But let me ask you also, it had just broken when you sat down with the president, the judge's ruling for CNN restoring Jim Acosta's credentials in that lawsuit against the White House. And he kind of said it was no big deal. We're going to play that later in the program, Chris. But right after that press conference, let me take you back, you went on the air and talked about how you, as a former White House correspondent, felt about Acosta's behavior. Let's take a look.
I've never seen anything like it. I covered the White House with Ronald Reagan for 6 years. I mean, most of the people there were serious reporters asking serious questions, but Jim Acosta, I thought, embarrassed himself to die.
And after that, a CNN executive did something extraordinary, put out a statement attacking you and saying, hey, Chris, Acosta doesn't work for state TV. It must be hard to sleep at night. What did you make of that?
I slept fine that night. Well, they were pushing back, and then I doubled down on it a few days later because people were asking. It was obviously a hot story. And I noticed that whoever the person was at CNN, who I'd never heard of, didn't fire back. There are two things, like a lot of things in life, there can be two things that are both true. One, I thought that Jim Acosta embarrassed himself. I thought he misbehaved. I had never seen anything like it. I covered the White House with Sam Donaldson. We were pretty aggressive with Ronald Reagan, but the idea that you'd stand up, first just to say, begin your question by saying, I want to challenge you, Mr. President, and then continue to ask questions, and then when you're told to sit down, to keep standing up and even kind of fight off an intern, I was astonished by it. Having said that,
but then the White House pulls his credentials.
Holding his pass was clearly a bridge too far, and it was a mistake. The president, in his answer to my question about it, and subsequently in a no big deal, I think they were stung by the fact that they lost and that they were, to a certain degree, trying to downplay a defeat. I will say I had talked to a couple of White House aides beforehand, and before the ruling came down, and they said, we're hearing at 60-40 we're going to lose. So they weren't shocked by the ruling by the judge.
Yeah, but it did put most of the media, including Fox News, in the position of siding with CNN. But that's not the same as condoning Jim Acosta's behavior. But that's a distinction that you just made, but that sometimes gets lost on people.
Absolutely.
I had this experience a half dozen times during the campaign. What would you say is the most challenging thing about interviewing Donald Trump?
You ask him a question and he will give you an answer, but sometimes there's a lot of other stuff around it. For instance, my first question was, how dark is your mood? And he proceeds to go into, he's fine, which kind of would have been the answer, but then he talks about the White House, then he went into the cemetery, and on and on.
Right.
And so you end up having to edit him, not in any way to censor him, but because you're trying to get the answer out of the camouflage, out of the underbrush.
Mm-hmm. You said to him quite bluntly that what you call fake news is sometimes news that you don't like. President pushed back very hard on that. But his supporters not only, I think, revel in the attacks on the press, but at the same time, it is true, as you noted, that a lot of the coverage of this president, whether it's warranted or not warranted, is negative. So it's not like he doesn't have something of a case in lashing out at the media coverage.
Well, this gets us back to the Acosta confrontation and the question I asked him, which was, why did you call on him in the first place? And to a certain degree, there seemed to be, a perfect symbiosis here. The president knows if I call Acosta, he'll do something obnoxious, and that'll just fire up my base. I don't think he thought Acosta was going to go as far as he did, and Acosta gets the spotlight to do something and get a lot of attention. It went further, I suspect, than either of them wanted, but I think they knew at the moment that the president called on Acosta, this was going to be a pothole, and they would both be able to play it to their benefit.
Chris Wallace, thanks very much for sitting down with us.
Thank you.
Russia investigation in the harshest terms yet, tweeting that it's a total mess and has gone absolutely nuts. They are screaming and shouting at people, horribly threatening them to come up with the answers they want. They are a disgrace to our nation and don't care how many lives they ruin. These are angry people, including the highly conflicted Bob Mueller, who worked for Obama for 8 years. They won't even look at all the bad acts and crimes on the other side. A total witch hunt like no other in American history. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist. Sarah Fisher, media reporter for Axios. And Mo Alithi, a former DNC official and Fox News contributor who runs Georgetown University's Institute of Politics. So the press, Emily, is covering this as a really overheated escalation on the president's part. Disgrace, absolutely nuts, even by the standards of all the previous Trump's attacks on the so-called witch hunt.
Right, and when the president is tweeting in all capital letters very angry things, it's understandable that the press would focus on that a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, in fact. But at the same time, the president has some frustrations about the scope of this investigation into what's supposed to be collusion that I think are rarely acknowledged to the extent that they should be in the press. So it's sort of like what you were talking about in your interview with Chris Wallace. Two things can be true, and I think that's the case here.
Sarah, as a factual matter, saying that Robert Mueller worked for Obama for 8 years is hardly the full story.
I mean, he not only didn't just work for Obama those years, he was hired under the Bush administration, and he's a registered Republican. So this is not somebody who's just some Democrat out to get him. He's a Republican who's trying to do his job. And even though the media is conflating some of his roles, where he supports, where he doesn't, none of us really know what's going on in Robert Mueller's head. He's never given an interview.
That's right. He doesn't try to compete in that space, Mo. The president also telling Chris Wallace he will probably not be sitting down for an interview with Mueller. He didn't make it 100%, but he said probably. Insiders tell me that Trump is just sick of this investigation and wants to bring it to a head. Could this escalation be the product of Trump having been immersed with his lawyers in preparing these answers to the Mueller questions and that kind of setting him off?
Yeah, look, I don't know what triggers Donald Trump. He's been frustrated with this investigation since day one, right? I mean, he's been frustrated. I mean, he finally got rid of Jeff Sessions, who he's been wanting to get rid of because of this investigation.
And because the Attorney General recused himself.
That's right. That's right, because the Attorney General took himself out of a position where he could have stopped this investigation. So the president's frustration, I guess I get it. His reactions, I don't. I think it doesn't serve him well politically, frankly. I think if he were to just sit back and say, fine, there's nothing there, but I will fully cooperate and show you that there's nothing there, I think it would take away this concern. But that's just not how he's wired. And
I do note that I remember from the Ken Starr days that he's not the only president to push back
That's
against
right.
a special counsel
That's
or
right.
independent prosecutor. All right.
That's right.
So in the interview with Chris Wallace, Chris asked the president about the appointment of acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker, who, of course, has a history of slamming the Mueller investigation. The president said that if Whitaker took any steps to curtail or rein in the investigation, the president said he'd leave it up to Whitaker, that he was not going to intervene. And then there was this question.
did you know before you appointed him that he had that record and was so critical of Robert Mueller?
I did not know that. I did not know he took views on the Mueller investigation as such.
Press a little skeptical on the point that he finally gets to appoint his own acting attorney general who has a well-documented record, and he had no idea that he was a Mueller critic.
Yeah, I mean, I find that hard to believe as well. I'm not sure how big of a deal that is, but at the same time, the president, in his interview with the Daily Caller this week, when he was asked about Whitaker, he did immediately transition into talking about the investigation. So I find it hard to believe. Yeah, it's not something that I'm going to freak out over.
All right, just real quickly, there's a lot of media chatter about indictments are coming any day now this week, but then they didn't come. So this was part of the speculation about why the president was lashing out.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you would expect him to be a little bit angsty about what could potentially come out here, but I think some of that coverage too might be a little bit overblown. We don't know what they're really looking into, and we're hearing reports that he's talking to even some like third-level players in this investigation.
I was going to make that point. I mean, we're down to talking about Roger Stone and his associates. I'm not saying that that's not important, but it's not. It doesn't seem like, from what we know now, that there's another major indictment in the works, and yet that was a lot of the press speculation about the president's comments.
Yeah, everyone should just stop speculating. I want the president. I want the president to just chill out and let this thing happen, right? And that's what Democrats are demanding. So should the press. The press should just chill out and let this thing play out. We will find out when it's time for us to find out. Mueller doesn't screw around.
The speculation has created such a circus, and it's really so unfounded in so many cases.
All right, I'm also in favor of curtailing speculation, but I'm not holding my breath. Ahead, top news outlets portraying Donald Trump as angry, furious, lashing out since the midterms. Is that expose reveals that the company deliberately denied that the site was awash in Russian propaganda and hate speech and phony news, and used some pretty sleazy tactics to neutralize critics. Mark Zuckerberg and his deputy Sheryl Sandberg spent years minimizing Facebook's many problems and then only reluctantly promising to do better.
Personally, I think the idea that fake news on Facebook, of which it's a very small amount of the content, influence the election in any way, I think is a pretty crazy idea.
We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry.
But dogged reporting by the Times shows that top Facebook executives warned that if the social network was too aggressive in going after Russia, Republicans would accuse the site of favoring Democrats, and users might feel duped. Times reporter Nick Confessori.
This is a company that knew there were things going on with this information as early as 2016, but didn't even tell their own board or the public what they knew until the fall of 2017 when the damage was already done.
What happened is they kept escalating the problem. At first, like, oh, it's not so bad. Oh, maybe it's a little worse. Oh, maybe it's a little worse. And I remember at the time saying it's like cockroaches. They are going to come out. They're everywhere.
Have any two individuals made more money while doing more damage to the United States?
Facebook hired a Republican PR firm in Washington, Definers Public Affairs, which used an affiliated conservative news site to blast out articles accusing rivals Google and Apple of unsavory business practices. And Facebook's firm did Oppo research on critics, trying to link them to big-time Democratic donor George Soros, as well as digging up information on senators preparing to grill Sandberg. Zuckerberg and Sandberg says they didn't know about the work of the firm, which the company has now fired. And they say they've done nothing wrong. Sandberg told CBS some allegations in the piece were absolutely not true. It's a very dark portrait of a tech giant that once got so much good press. The question now is whether Zuckerberg can finally police Facebook's content or whether the global machine he built is beyond repair. Coming up, a legal setback for the White House as a judge temporarily restores Jim Acosta's credentials, but is it the free speech victory that some are claiming? And later, a federal judge issued a temporary ruling for CNN on Friday, not on First Amendment grounds, but because the White House violated Acosta's due process in revoking his credentials. That happened after last week's news conference.
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I
that's
was
enough.
going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr.
Excuse
President.
me. That's enough. I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person.
Chris Wallace asked the president about the judge's ruling.
What they said, though, is that we have to create rules and regulations for conduct, et cetera, et cetera. We're doing that. We're going to write them up right now. It's not a big deal. And if he misbehaves, we'll throw him out. Or we'll stop the news conference, or somebody else. I'm not just saying about Acosta. CNN writes very fake news.
I want to thank all of my colleagues in the press who supported us this week. And I want to thank the judge for the decision he made today. And let's go back to work.
Emily, the judge made a point of saying this is a narrow ruling. It's not on First Amendment grounds. It's about a White House decision-making process that the judge said was shrouded in mystery. But with Acosta now back at the White House, at least for now, is it something of a win for press freedom?
I wouldn't say it's a win for press freedom. I think it's a win for CNN. And the president politically, I think, is smart to downplay it and say, listen, because it was about due process. It was about, we're going to implement rules for conduct at the briefings, which I hope to God take because they've turned into such circuses. And Acosta is a big part of that. And so if moving forward, this can be a good thing because the White House will implement rules and reporters will know that they have to abide by them, lest they get on the wrong side of this whole debate about this legal argument. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. I mean, this story is just. The more we talk about Jim Acosta,
the president had a throwaway line with Chris Wallace saying, maybe we'll just turn the cameras off that show the reporters and deprive them of airtime. Now, Fox News has been taking some heat from its fans online, Sarah, for filing this friend of the court brief on CNN's behalf, as if that amounts to condoning Jim Acosta's conduct, as opposed to saying we don't think presidents should be able to somewhat arbitrarily take away credentials.
Well, some of those fans should think back to 2009 when all of the media backed Fox News against the Obama administration. So
when Fox was left out of a round robin of network interviews.
The thing is, when it comes to access to the White House press corps tends to stand in solidarity so that they can protect themselves, so that if they are subject to these types of things in the future, they are subject to the same type of support. But going back to what you said, both things can be true here. You can disagree with Acosta's conduct and still think that the White House acted in bad faith by taking away a press credential without due process.
I'll come back to that, but let me first play some comments by CNN commentator and lawyer Jeff Toobin about the significance of the decision.
This case was not certainly just about CNN or even about the White House.
Right.
This was about government officials in state houses, in city halls, whether they can throw out reporters who they view as annoyances.
Mo, do you agree with that broader interpretation? And in the court hearing, a Justice Department lawyer said, well, the president has no obligation to let any reporter even onto the White House grounds. He could ban them all. Now, that might be true, but it would certainly be politically challenging.
No, and I agree with that. Look, I think Jay Wallace said it very well in his statement from Fox News that that press access should not be weaponized. That the president can come up, this judge ruling may give the president and the White House the ability to now come up with some sort of a process so that there can be due process. But I worry about a president or a White House press secretary saying, I don't like your coverage, and therefore I'm going to call you rude or pick a fight with you so that I then have grounds to throw you out. That is not beyond the realm of possibility with this White House, where the president calls people whose coverage he doesn't like the enemy of the American people. It worries me that he is setting his own precedent that can be very dangerous for press freedom.
Acosta also picks fights in the way that he lectures and debates the president when he gets the chance. By the way, Sarah Sanders has sent a letter to Acosta now, formal letters. They're still trying to proceed with revoking his credentials permanently. So whether or not this raises issues, constitutional issues of free speech, because eventually, if this case proceeds, the judge will get to that. It kind of shifted the spotlight from Jim Acosta to the president's attacks on the press.
Right, yeah, but I do think one thing that's been lost in all of this about the entire conversation in regards to access in this White House is that Donald Trump called on Jim Acosta in the first place at this press conference, and that's what started it. He's happy to talk to the people that spread what he purports to call fake news.
Well, he likes the confrontation.
Yeah, they're constantly calling on them. They're constantly, I mean, obviously this White House has a relationship with the New York Times. They have a relationship with all of these different media outlets. And so for as much complaining as there is about access in this White House, the White House does provide a lot of access and is happy to engage with these outlets.
Yeah, the president takes a lot of questions, although last week, he really snapped back at one reporter. He said it was a stupid question, and he went after April.
I mean, that's right. He'll take the question, but when a legitimate question comes, he'll immediately snap at them, call them fake news, throw them under the bus, revoke their press credentials. So,
fairness, he does that sometimes. It's not all the time.
Right.
Fair, but
he did answer Acosta's
when
question
he does, right? But then he launches into the personal attack. There wouldn't have been any oxygen there if he had just answered the question.
Well, there wouldn't have been any
moved
oxygen if Jim Acosta had given up the microphone. I mean, this was the thing that prompted criticism from many of his colleagues, including Chris Wallace. But let me ask you about an interesting thing that came up in the hearing, Sarah. A government lawyer went in before the judge and said, well, you know what? CNN has all these other reporters who cover the White House, and they have 50 credentialed people. So, somebody else could cover the president. And Acosta can still cover the White House by watching on TV. That seems to me to not get the way in why this is an important principle to news organizations.
Nope, it's an important principle because you're setting a precedent about how we're interpreting laws for the future. A lot of these questions, by the way, to your point, they've come up in local jurisdictions, but we've never seen it being played out with a sitting president in the White House. And so it's not about whether or not, you got 50 other reporters to cover this. Yeah. It's ensuring that the law is upheld to apply to every single person at all times.
Well, my point is that no news organizations wants to let any politician be in a position of saying who can cover him or her, and just say, well, you can just get someone else, and Acosta is their guy. I also, some at the White House think, well, by doing this, that they took Acosta's oxygen away for a week, but they also gave a lot of oxygen, obviously, to the lawsuit. And finally, this is why I said it was a strategic misstep, and that is, for all of the controversy surrounding Jim Acosta, even among his colleagues, the White House kind of turned him into a journalistic martyr because other organizations felt to be fueling his push for another White House shakeup aimed at such targets as Homeland Security Chief Kirstjen Nielsen, and how many times have we been through this one, Chief of Staff John Kelly. Oh, I thought we were going to a soundbite. All right, so Emily, live television, folks. The president does seem resentful about the coverage of Paris. He brought up the coverage of him not visiting the cemetery in France, this potential shakeup. But then he tells Chris Wallace, well, that Washington Post story about Fury is based on fictional sources. Your take on that and the similar pieces?
Well, so, and in bringing in the similar pieces, we talked earlier about the phrase, the cocoon of bitterness. There was something, I think this was in the LA Times story. That was LA Times. The Post story referred to as churlish churlish temper, splenetic tweets. I think some of this is absolutely over the top. I also think there's another thing to say about the president not actually hiding a lot of his frustrations. As we mentioned earlier, he's tweeting out in all caps. I mean, it's not as though he's necessarily trying to say that he isn't frustrated with these things. It's more about the chaos in the White House. That's what frustrates him. And when you have these narratives constructed on the accounts of anonymous sources, I understand why he would take issue with it.
Unless the anonymous sources are senior White House officials or top Trump advisors, as they sometimes are. Now, look, the media have this chaos narrative. And it would be a big deal if Trump dumped John Kelly, who did not give a resounding vote of confidence in the Wallace interview after saying he'd stay till 2020. But, you know, Ryan Zinke, Kirstjen Nielsen, in any other administration, I think the press would treat this as the normal turnover after a midterm election in which your party lost one chamber.
I think there's two things at play here. One is you've got a White House staff that likes to talk to the press. They like to do it anonymously. They like to leak. And people do that for different reasons. Sometimes it's an agenda. Sometimes it just makes them feel more self-importance. Right? So that's number one, is you got a White House staff that likes to talk. And two, increasingly clear, you've got a White House staff that doesn't always necessarily know what's in the president's head. And so they may be hearing something or interpreting something and putting something out there about a staff shakeup. But I will say this. We have gone through this cycle umpteen times now with this president, where there's a leak and a denial, and then the thing actually happens not long afterwards.
Well, White House insiders tell me, and it also reminds me, reminds them of the spring of 2017 when there was such constant leaking and backbiting and sniping anonymously by people around Donald Trump. And it died down for a while under John Kelly, and now really seems to be back. And some of these leaks may be coming from places like the State Department and Homeland Security and the NSC, where certain officials have been targeted, which leads me to my question for Sarah. The First Lady of the United States, Melania Trump, publicly issued a statement, none of us has ever seen anything like it, calling for the firing of John Bolton's deputy at the National Security Council, Mira Ricardel, who has since been transferred. The president was asked about that again by Chris Wallace, and he said, well, she's not exactly in line for a job at the United Nations, meaning she's not diplomatic, but he liked her anyway. Other First Ladies have obviously, Nancy Reagan is one, wielded power behind the scenes, but did this deserve all the coverage it got because of its unique nature?
It is unique, and it's unique for Melania. She tends to be somebody who stays in the background, who doesn't speak out a lot. In fact, the only other time she was really speaking out that caused this media ripple was when she made comments about, I can watch whatever I want with CNN. So it's newsworthy that we're getting inside Melania's head. Does it have,
she wore the jacket.
Of course. But does it have any actual weight to it? At this point, we can't really tell.
Well, I mean, this woman is losing her job, even though she'll be going elsewhere. So you talk about the press being wedded to a chaos narrative, but sometimes the White House does seem chaotic.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to
I think
give you a fuller portrait here.
Yes, please. No, I think there's a very fair point to be made. And to some extent, the fact that there are chaos narratives stories coming out of the White House probably means that there's chaos because people are leaking them for various reasons. That being said, I do think some of it's over the top when we're talking about the cocoon of bitterness. I don't know how accurate that is.
We also don't have a win to point to right now. He just went through a midterm election where Democrats swept. This whole session's the
Republicans
House.
Won the Senate.
That's right. The Democrats took the House. But you have this drama unfolding between Sessions and Whitaker. You have the whole media narrative around his trip in Paris, which didn't go very well. I think he doesn't have a lot of wins to point to, so it makes it look tumultuous.
The president says that the White House is a well-oiled machine. That's what he told Chris Wallace. Just brief comment.
That's fake news. I mean, look, it's not a well-oiled machine. I think anyone that says that, it is a chaos place. Now, that may be fine for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, his entire life, his entire career, has liked to harness chaos, or at least tried to. He thrives on that personally. I don't think it serves the White House well and the government well, but that's his style. So to deny it is just to deny a simple fact.
Maybe it's not chaos, it's just conflict, letting different factions go at it, but all of it spills into the press. Sarah Fisher, and Emily Jashinsky, thanks so much for joining us this Sunday. After the break, Monica Lewinsky says she considered suicide during the ordeal